All right, guys, back at it with another one of our chapters here. We've got chapter 15, psychological disorders. And my goal is to get you some introductory material as well as begin discussing the many psychological disorders that are out there. All right, and as an introduction, I've put some familiar faces on the screen here. Most you should recognize. Okay, Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, diagnosed bipolar disorder. You can see Charlie Sheen down here, diagnosed quote unquote substance abuse, is something you just need to make note of, is also considered a psychological disorder by definition, but we're not going to talk about it in this chapter since we've already talked about that in a previous chapter. We'll get into some personality disorders. All right, here, John Nash, if you guys have ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, world-renowned economist, but also struggled with his paranoid schizophrenia. Great movie starring Russell Crowe. I suggest you check that out. It's called A Beautiful Mind. Postpartum depression with Brooke Shields would be a type of depression that sets in after the birth of a child. All right. So here we go. Again, I just wanted to share a few um, familiar faces. All right, who might look perfect in on the screen or in front of a microphone, but battling some of their own demons. Okay, and keep that word in mind here. A little bit later, we'll talk about demons more linked with the psychological disorders. All right, when we're talking about a psychological disorder, we're talking about abnormal behaviors. In order for it to be diagnosed a disorder, a person has to display deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional behaviors uh, on a daily basis. Okay, so deviant, different, distressful, meaning causing stress to the self and others, and then dysfunctional, meaning doesn't adapt to everyday life situations like you and I can adapt. For a complete list of the psychological disorders, you need to look in what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. You can see in that picture there, the manual has grown over the years. All right, it used to be a little bitty pamphlet, and then it just keeps getting larger and larger. This is the third edition. This is the third revised edition, the fourth revised. We're currently at what is the DSM-5, and I would suspect this is 2020, a revised edition coming out again because this came out a few years ago. So it's constantly being revised. It's being added to more than it's being subtracted to, which is unfortunate, but at least we're trying to gain knowledge of all the disorders that are out there. So speaking of demons, all right, when when early mental illness um, was being visible, a lot of times it was chalked up as evil spirits possessed by a demon. And this is a skull which was supposedly dated back to either the Stone Age or Bronze Ages. And in order to extract those evil spirits, some pretty inhumane treatment was done. And you can see this is the belief with some archaeologists is that the skulls were drilled and those evil spirits were drawn out. Thankfully, that's not how we practice medicine nowadays, and that is thanks to people like Philippe Pinel in the late 1700s and then Dorothea Dix in the United States. These individuals believed in the humane treatment and the medicinal treatment of patients. So Philippe Pinel was a French reformer. All right, he built a mental hospital in France, and then Dorothea Dix followed it up about 40 years later. So by the early 1800s, there weren't asylums anymore where inhumane treatment, unethical experiments were being done on the mentally ill. By the early 1800s, doctors were now operating on what we call the medical model. All right, that is that these are um, sicknesses that have physical causes and should be treated humanely with proper diagnosis, proper care, and proper medicines, proper therapy. That's called the medical model. Okay, when we try to explain psychological disorders, most psychiatrists, most doctors operate under what's called the biopsychosocial social approach. What does that mean? That means that psychological disorders are a combination, can be explained by a combination of biological, psychological, and social cultural influences. And you can see that this is explained pretty well in this graphic right here. A psychological disorder could have links to an imbalance in chemicals, perhaps poor brain structure, heavy amounts of stress or trauma in one's life would be a psychological influence, or a social cultural example would be hearing voices in one culture might be schizophrenic, like in our culture, but in another culture, it may be viewed as a sign of some sort of spiritual power, a shaman, a medicine man. So very interesting take on how we explain these psychological disorders. That's known as the biopsychosocial approach. All right, now how many, how much? That means what sorts of statistics are out there when it comes to psychological disorders. Make note, this does not include substance abuse. All right, so if you throw out drug and alcohol addictions, approximately a quarter of the U.S. population has a diagnosed mental disorder. I think that number's higher. This is taken from 2008. I wish I had a bigger stat. The book is using this stat, so I'm going to share it with you. It's relatively unchanged. It's always floated around 25 to 30% of the American population. My guess is that it's higher because a lot of adults don't go get treatment. They don't get diagnoses because there's a fear that with being labeled mentally ill could lead to difficulty getting a job or more health insurance due to existing health, medical conditions. Okay, there's even a statistic for children. All right, we'll go into what are some of the more common mental disorders affecting children, many of them under the umbrella of attention deficit disorders and anxiety disorders. So if we had to rank them, here is your top five. All right, the phobias seem to dominate the top spot. A social phobia, I mean the fear of social situations, but then there's also specific phobias that fall into that percentage, like the fear of heights, the fear of snakes. Depression in second place, along with bipolar disorder. Those are called mood disorders. Attention deficit, followed by PTSD. We all know what that is. And then lastly, generalized anxiety. So spots 1, 4, and 5 are all anxiety disorders. The anxiety disorders definitely are of a major concern in our society. The World Health Organization says the U.S. ranks highest in having most people with a diagnosed mental illness of all countries. Okay, here is my goal. My goal is to try to teach you guys the following 6 categories, from mood all the way down to the schizophrenic disorders. Fingers crossed that I can get through all of them. For today, though, I just want to focus on the mood disorder. So here we go. A mood disorder is any disorder as characterized by emotional extremes. All right, on one extreme, on the very low mood extreme, we have depression. All right, so I want to start with one that's pretty recognizable for a lot of you. Whether you've had bouts of this or you know someone, I think we can all, with relative accuracy, list some of the symptoms. Okay, loneliness, feeling inadequate, losing interest in things they find fun, all the way to some pretty severe symptoms of suicidal thoughts, weight loss, weight gain, okay, and then maybe even levels of psychosis. Okay, let's understand that there's a difference between clinical depression and normal depression. I bet everyone listening to this has suffered what's called normal depression. Normal depression is you had a bad day, or you had a bad couple of days. You got a bad grade on a test, you broke up with a girlfriend, a fight with your parents, and you feel awful afterwards. Thankfully, time heals it. That's what we would call normal depression. Clinical depression, all right, would take on another more intense series of symptoms. Let me back up and talk about SAD. SAD is known as seasonal affective disorder. That could be classified more under normal depression. That's when, like for example, so the weather in St. Louis in January and February can just cause low mood and greater chances of depressed feelings. But thankfully, with spring coming around and sun shining, that depressed-like feeling can go away. So that's seasonal affective disorder, which is nicely abbreviated SAD. Okay, now clinical forms of depression are major depressive disorder. This would be someone who displays 5 or more symptoms of depression lasting 2 or more weeks, okay, with no additional drug withdrawals, not linked with any type of drug withdrawal symptoms, let's say. That's known as major depressive syndrome. So examples of what this might be is combine the anguish of grief, that deep sadness of grief, combined with the physical sluggishness of jet lag. That's going to be what doctors describe major depressive disorder as. And then there's something known as persistent depressive disorder, also known as dysthymia. So this is a much more mild type of depression, but it lasts multiple years. So major depressive is intense. It comes on quickly. A lot of times it can be due to a tragic life event, and then with time it can go away. Dysthymia seems to be more of a biological type of depression that no matter what type of day you have, what type of life events, you could have a really, really great day, but when that person with dysthymia comes home that night, goes, eh, my day was okay, I guess. That's dysthymia. All right, a couple other mood disorders would be on the high end, you've got what's known as mania. So this is someone who's wildly hyperactive, euphoric, optimistic. I love this. If depression is slow motion, then mania is that fast forward. This is obviously just an illustration, but it's a picture of someone who I would imagine as being manic, just fidgety, hyperactive, unable to slow down. Okay, those episodes of mania can last hours, days, even months. What's more likely to happen is people shift from episodes of mania back to episodes of depression. This is what's known as bipolar disorder. All right, and a couple other notes about it is heredity is a big factor. So bipolar does run in the family. And these episodes, once again, can be hours, days, even months, where a person can be manic and then they flip the switch to depression. I'm going to share a video with you guys of the lead singer of the band Creed. His name is Scott Stapp. He is diagnosed bipolar, and he goes into some interesting stories of what it was like to be in a manic episode. So give a listen to this if you want. It's quite interesting to hear it come from someone who truly has the disorder. And you can see here there are lots of different behaviors that go along with bipolar. On the manic side, you can see on the left these here, and then on the depressive side over here. So take a good look at these. I don't mean to scare a lot of you guys listening to the video, but the onset is before the age of 30. So yes, you might not know or get diagnosed bipolar until that late of age, and most of the time you'll know it if there seems to be a family history of it. Okay, let's try to explain these very quickly. The causes of mood disorders. There's always going to be a biological cause for psychological symptoms. That's not true. Not all psychological disorders, but several of them. So one simple explanation could be a chemical imbalance. All right, so individuals with depression have noted a low balance of serotonin and norepinephrine. Okay, it's very scarce in depressed patients, and there seems to be an abundance in manic patients. On a social level, causes of, say, depression could be learned helplessness. That is people who just give up on themselves, give up on life after a series of bad events. So just one thing after another, just they can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. They start to give up. That's what's known as learned helplessness. Statistically, it seems to be a little bit more prevalent in women than men. Why? Men report spending more time in light anxiety activities like sports, video game playing, TV watching, partying, possibly avoiding things that make them feel overwhelmed. Women, on the other hand, tend to overthink more often and tend to ruminate on things, leading to more swings in mood. And then finally, this is really great, is how a person explains a bad event. It's called explanatory style. And this is portrayed very nicely in your book. Hi, guys. Uh, on page 635, take a look right up there. Figure 15.8, this sums it up really nicely. I'm going to use the example of breaking up with a girlfriend. All right, so let's say that's the major life event. You could look at this in one of two ways, according to psychologists. You could look at how you interpret the timeliness of getting over it. If you have what's called a stable mindset, when it comes to timeliness, you have the attitude of, I'm never going to get over this. I'm never going to get over breaking up with my girlfriend. It's recommended that you have a more temporary mindset. This is hard, but hey, I'll get over it. And then how do you interpret the amount of impact? A global mindset is, man, I can't do anything without her. That's called global. A specific mindset is, you know what? She was just one part of my life. I'm going to miss her, yes, but I've got others to get me through it. It's just a specific moment in time, a specific type of impact. And then finally, who do you blame? If you blame yourself for all your faults, our breakup, my job loss, everything was my fault, it's less likely to uh, get better. But if you externalize it, if you say, hey, it takes two to make this work, or hey, it was also her fault, That's called external, better chance of successful coping. All right, so that's explanatory style, and that rounds out the mood disorders.